speakers here and then a discussion in the same vein as the first session we had this morning. And without further ado, let me just introduce our first panelist. Oh, by the way, I'm Ben Schoenthal. I teach in the religion program here, and I'm very grateful to Jesse and to Jamin for having me. But let's get started. Our first speaker is Azim Shariff. He is the Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair of Psychology at UBC. He also runs the Center for Applied Moral Psychology, where he studies the interaction of morality, of religion, of culture, of cultural attitudes, and of economics. And in addition to his work on religion, he's also done some very interesting work on sort of the ethics around self-driving cars, which hopefully he'll get to mention today as well. I'll just mention one other thing about him. I've just met him, but I might just even embarrass him having just met him, which is that he also was a speaker on one of my favorite podcasts, Invisible Brain. Hidden Brain, sorry, and it just was very excited to meet him today, and I know he's going to give a great talk. So he'll speak now on the invention of hell. See?
Thank you. Thank you, one person who applauded. All right, so when I was a teenager, I read this book, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man by James Joyce. Has anybody read it? Long time ago, yeah. It was about 20 years ago for me. I don't remember anything about it, with the exception of this one part in the middle where the main character is a schoolboy, and he listens to this sermon on hell. And it gives this multiple page-long description of how terrible hell is and how long eternity is, how long the eternity that one would have to spend there were one to be eternally damned. It's all I remember from the book. I still remember it 20 years later. It terrified me. And it terrified the main character. And it was designed to terrify, not wholly by James Joyce, not by any particular priest who was delivering the sermon, not by any pope, but really by a cultural story that's been built upon and refined for literally thousands of years. So that idea of a morally dependent afterlife, we know exists at least back to ancient Egypt, where after you would die, your heart would be weighed against the feather of truth, and if it was found wanting, you would be either devoured by a crocodile or thrown into a lake of fire. That lake of fire idea went on to influence the imagery of hell that's associated with Christianity and Islam. In the Old Testament, there is no hell, but there still is quite a malevolent streak. So this is a passage by Richard Dawkins from The God Delusion. He says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. So a harsh indictment indeed, but I would say this is designed as well. So why is it the case that we have such angry gods presiding over us and such terrifying afterlives waiting for us beneath us? To answer that question, I want to turn to a quote from this gentleman here. This is Theodosius Jabjensky. He was a geneticist from the last century, and he, towards the end of his life, wrote an essay with this title, "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." And his point was that prior to Darwinian evolution, biology was not really a scientific field as much as it was just a smattering of unconnected observations. So gentlemen scholars would go out for walks in the woods, and they would record this beetle acts this way, and this frog has spots, and this leaf is serrated that. And it was this smattering of disconnected observations until Darwin came along and gave us an explanatory theory that united all these observations by saying that they serve a particular function, and that function is survival in their niche. Now, a number of us over the last 20 years have been applying that same evolutionary lens to religion. And we make the argument that just as evolution can answer the why question for organisms, evolutionary thinking can also answer the why question behind the various elements of religion. that this theory of evolution applies not just to genetic organisms, but also to cultural ideas. And over time, what we've seen is an evolution of religious ideas. That the ideas that are connected to religions have served particular functions themselves and have survived on the basis of the degree to which they can actually serve those functions. Today, what we see is a legacy of a process of trial and error between competing religious ideas that have survived because they've been able to allow the societies they're connected to overcome particular challenges. And the biggest challenge that those societies have faced is how to get large groups of anonymous strangers to cooperate together. That's been the paramount challenge of large societies. Now, why does that explain the angry bully gods and the terrifying hells? Well, the reason for that is that punishment is necessary for cooperation. And the best study that I've heard that demonstrates this was this great study that was done by a German economist named Bettina Rockenbach and her colleagues, where what they did is they took a group of people and they made them play a series of economic games where you had the option of doing something in the group interest or doing something selfish. And you did this over a series of times, and you had to choose which one you were going to do, and there were groups of people doing it. But there were two critical things. She had two societies set up, one in which you engaged in these economic games over time, and there was no possibility of punishment. Whereas in another one, there was a possibility of punishment, where you could decide that if somebody was acting selfish, you could spend some of your money to punish them, to take away a larger degree of their money. And then the second thing was that she let people choose which society they wanted to be part of, and they could switch at any time. So they could switch between, say, the punishing one and going over to the non-punishing one, or switch between the non-punishing one and going over to the punishing one. And she wanted to see what people would do. Now this graph is there's a lot of information on it, but basically what it shows, the light gray bars are the people in the punishing society, and the white bars are the people in the non-punishing society. To begin with, 2/3 of the people decided they wanted to be part of the hippy-dippy society that didn't have any punishment. But over time, all but 5% decided to make the switch over to the punishing society. Because what they found was that you couldn't sustain cooperation in a society unless you had people punishing those who acted selfishly. It wasn't enough to just have the carrot of cooperation. You needed the stick of punishment with it. And that's how you were able to suppress selfishness and create a cooperative society. So then there is the leap to supernatural punishment. And it seems there as well, the stick of supernatural punishment seems more effective than the carrot of supernatural reward. This was a study that we did almost 10 years ago now. We had people come into the lab and describe their belief in God on these various adjectives. And these adjectives represent a punitive, angry side of God and a forgiving, loving side of God. And we had them also play a game where they could cheat. It was kind of like Jesse's game, but for college students, so they had a math task. We made it very tempting for them to cheat at the math task, and we wanted to see who would cheat. Would it be the people who believed in a forgiving God? Would it be the people who believed in a punishing God? I will orient you to the graph. Basically, what we see here on the y-axis is your correlation with cheating. Higher numbers, any bar that goes up suggests that people who believed in that kind of God were more likely to cheat. Any bars that go down below 0 means that that was negatively predicting of cheating. We had two studies. This is what you saw for people who believed in the angry aspects of God. And interestingly, this is what you saw for people who believed in the forgiving parts of God. So the more punishing and the less forgiving people believed in a God, the less likely they were to cheat. Now, that was a correlational study. We can't tell any causal story there. But more recently, there was a pair of Turkish psychologists, Yilmaz and Bahçekapli, who did an interesting experiment where what they did is they had people read passages from the Quran. These were Muslim participants. Either they had a neutral condition or they read about a non-punishing aspect of Allah in the Quran or a punishing aspect. And then they wanted to see, after reading those particular passages, depending on what group you were in, how likely would you say that you intend to give to charity, to volunteer, to donate blood, whatever, your charitable intentions afterwards. And what they found is there was a slight increase, but not a statistically significant increase, if you read a passage from the Quran about Allah that stressed his non-punitive nature. But when people read the punitive one, there was a larger increase. So there what you find is that the more people are reminded of the punishing nature of God, the more they intend to give to charity. What about the forgiving side? So this is back to a study that we did. This was led by Amber De Bono. These were all Catholic participants. And what we did is we had them write about various types of people or gods. So they either had a control condition, they wrote about a punishing human, they wrote about a loving human, they wrote about a punishing God, and they wrote about a loving God. And then what we did is we had them do this task where they had the opportunity, we made it again very tempting for them to do this, to think that they could do this anonymously, which is steal money from our experiment. And the way we did this is we said, we have to be somewhere else. Here's a task you have to do. Depending on how well you do it, you have to pay yourself. Here's the money. Just take as much as you deserve based on how many questions you got right. And then we had a research assistant wait outside the door and catch them as they left and said, actually, just kidding. We know how much you took. And we wanted to see how much people would actually overpay themselves for the task. So this is what you saw in the control condition. This is what you saw in the two punishing human and loving human control conditions. In the punishing God condition, you saw basically there's no statistical difference between any of these. And they're not statistically really different from zero. But because you guys know how graphs work, you know that this next number is going to be different, which is that this is how much they overpaid themselves, this is how much they stole from the study, if they spent 10 minutes writing about the forgiving nature of God. So it seems like in that case, there was a licensing, a moral licensing aspect of writing about God's forgiving nature, which not only did not deter them from stealing, but it actually encouraged them to steal more than they otherwise would. Okay, so let's actually now turn to afterlife beliefs specifically. And in addition, we will turn away from these sort of artificial social psychology measures of antisocial and pro-social behavior and look at actually some sort of real-world behavior. So this is a study I did with Micah Remtula, and basically what we wanted to do is look at, between countries, how does the belief in heaven and the belief in hell predict crime rates? So we found all the data we could find on this. We had 53 countries for which we had full data for all these measures. We had a list of crimes, and we had a list of predictors. There's pretty reliable data on the percentage of people within a country who believe in heaven and the percentage of people who believe in hell. And then to make sure that we weren't looking at some sort of spurious relationship based on some sort of statistical artifact, we controlled for all these other things, right? So we know that in places with higher levels of inequality, there's more crime. We didn't want to just show that we're picking up on an inequality effect, so we statistically controlled for all these other factors. And here's what we found. So again, let me orient you to the graph. Here you have all the crime rates. Anything that goes above the zero line is going to represent a positive relationship, meaning predicting more of that crime. Anything below is going to predict less crime, less of that crime. I'm going to first show you how, when you control for all those other things that I showed you, how the actual level of belief in God, just as a general concept, predicts crime rates, which is like this. Basically, there's no hint of a relationship, and it's all in different directions. So it seems like just believing in God, once you control for these other factors, does not relate to the crime rates in these countries. But you can look at, and now we're controlling for the opposite of these, right? So this is the percentage of people who believe in heaven, controlling for the percentage of people who believe in hell, positively predicting crime rates for belief in heaven, belief in hell negatively predicts crime rates. So another way to think about this is that you can take, because countries where a lot of people believe in heaven tend to be the countries where a lot of people believe in hell as well, but almost invariably more people believe in heaven than believe in hell. So what you can do is you can take a subtraction score. If, say, there are 95% of the country believes in heaven and 70% believes in hell, you can look at, well, the degree to which there are people who believe in heaven who don't believe in hell. So that is an index of what you could call supernatural, that says supernatural benevolence down there. So the percentage of people who believe in heaven unchecked by a belief in hell. And you can plot that against crime, and what you see is the more there are people who believe in heaven who don't believe in hell, the more crime there is in that country. All right. So it seems like there is this negative relationship between immoral behavior and belief in hell. Hell seems to be associated with less crime, and actual other aspects of religious malevolence seem to be associated with lower antisocial behavior. So then why heaven? The astute viewer will be asking, if you just said that what religions are supposed to do is stabilize cooperation, get people to follow the rules, and you have this feature of hell that does that, why do you also have this feature of heaven? And I think it's a really interesting question. Because if it's the case that heaven and forgiving and loving God seem to license people to engage in immoral behavior, why would you have this thing which actually seems to undermine the purpose for the group? Well, I think it's because heaven does other things. The belief in heaven is associated with higher self-esteem, more well-being, psychological coping, health resiliency. It serves other functions. And if you think about religions as these evolutionary systems, they comprise of different aspects which have evolved at different times to serve different purposes. And I think heaven and hell are like that. They've emerged to serve different purposes. So though supernatural malevolence, supernatural punishment, hell, may be something which gets us to act good, the more benevolent side of religion and the benevolent side of our afterlives actually inspires us to feel good. Now, what's interesting about that is that those things do different things for the good of religion and for the good of the group. Acting good helps us cooperate. It helps societies stabilize. It helps them work reasonably harmoniously together. However, feeling good is a much better recruitment tool. When you have a lot of different religions all competing for adherence, it's much harder to go up to somebody and say, you should leave your religion and join my religion. My God is angry, and you're more likely to go to hell. That's a harder sell than saying, well, actually, I have a much more benevolent religion that you could join, and you don't have to worry about any of that hell stuff. And so when you have high religious competition, there's more recruitment value in heaven. So you can see the purpose of the religious malevolence is to increase cooperation. The purpose of religious benevolence, from this cultural evolutionary perspective, is for recruitment. One serves the benefit of the group, and the other serves the benefit of the individual. And indeed, if you look between countries, here we have again that percentage of people who believe in heaven minus percentage of people who believe in hell, and you plot that against happiness, against life satisfaction. You see the places which believe in heaven more, unchecked by hell, tend to be happier places. But you'll notice a couple other things about those. So you see up there in the top right, those particular group of countries, those tend to be predominantly individualistically oriented countries, A. And B, they tend to be countries that aren't doing very badly. These are countries which actually have their stuff together, and they're not crime-ridden hellholes. You have countries as Finland, Australia, Sweden, some other countries up there. Those tend to be pretty well-functioning societies. Why? Well, I think it's because instead of just relying on religion to enforce cooperation, they've been able to have good trust in and faith in secular alternatives, secular institutions of justice that work very well and that people generally trust to work very well. And it is still the greatest negative predictor of religiosity between countries is faith in the rule of law. And I think that's actually probably a positive thing. It's a positive alternative, because the more we can rely on this sense of institutional and proportional laws and justice, the more the burden of cooperation can be lifted off the shoulders of the religions, which means they are free to sort of shift, to sort of evolve more towards being directed towards a more benevolent, positive afterlife belief, a general sense of religious benevolence. And the more we can take all of that terror, all those hells and angry gods and weighing of hearts and terrifying, frightening sermons for schoolboys and let that all go. And I think that's a positive thing. All right, thank you.